The bass line hums like a memory, low, steady, familiar. Somewhere in a small Chicago club, a young man named Keni Burke once stood beneath the dim lights, his fingers shaping a sound that would one day echo through generations. The crowd didn't realize it then, but they were listening to the heartbeat of a future classic. What happens to a sound that defined an era when the world stops listening? What happens to the artist who gave it life? This isn't a story of fame or fortune. It's the story of rhythm, soul, and a quiet genius who helped define the sound of American music only to be forgotten by the industry he helped build. Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the spotlight ever found him, there was a house on the south side of Chicago filled with music, laughter, and discipline. Inside that modest home lived a family who believed in harmony not just in sound, but in life. Among them was a young boy named Kenneth Burke, born on the 28th of September 1953, who would later be known to the world as Keni Burke. His father, Clarence Sr., worked as a police detective, strict, determined, and deeply protective. But behind that badge was a man who loved music just as much as justice. He became both coach and manager for his children, molding them into what the world would soon call the first family of soul. His mother, Betty, carried the same spirit, gentle yet unwavering. She gave their group its name, the Five Stairsteps, because when her children stood side by side, they looked like steps leading upward. In the streets of Chicago, music was everywhere, on porches, in churches, at block parties. The sound of Curtis Mayfield, Sam Cooke, and the Impressions drifted through the air. And for Keni, that sound wasn't just background noise. It was a promise, a dream that maybe, one day, he could be part of that rhythm. By the age of 13, Keni was already playing bass with confidence far beyond his years. He and his siblings Clarence Jr., Alohe, James, and Dennis rehearsed late into the night under the guidance of their father. Every note had to be perfect, every harmony precise. What began as a family pastime was slowly turning into something much bigger. Their big break came when the Five Stairsteps won a local talent competition at the Regal Theater, one of Chicago's legendary stages. That victory caught the attention of Curtis Mayfield himself, who signed them to his Windy City label. Suddenly, Keni wasn't just a neighborhood kid with a bass, he was part of a recording group, playing alongside one of the greatest names in soul music. Their debut single, You Waited Too Long, introduced the world to their warm harmonies and tight musicianship. The follow-up, Don't Waste Your Time, confirmed it. This family from Chicago had something special. As their fame grew, Keni found himself learning the language of studios, microphones, and lights. For a teenager, it was overwhelming but also intoxicating. Yet, amid the early success, he never lost sight of where he came from. Chicago remained his classroom. The city taught him groove, humility, and survival lessons that would carry him through decades of changing sounds. By the end of the decade, the family had begun to travel the country, performing on television shows and stages that once seemed unreachable. Still, behind the applause, Keni was quietly discovering who he was, not just as a member of the Five Stairsteps, but as a musician with his own voice. Before the red carpets and studio sessions, there was just that boy from Chicago standing beside his brothers and sister, eyes full of wonder, bass in hand, dreaming of a sound that could outlive him. The late 1960 were a time when soul music wasn't just a sound, it was a movement. And at the center of it stood a group of teenagers from Chicago, dressed in matching suits, their harmonies tighter than blood. The Five Stairsteps were no longer just a family band. They had become a symbol of youthful soul, the kind that made people believe in possibility again. For young Keni Burke, every stage felt like another world. At only 15, he was already a professional bassist, recording and touring with a poise that astonished older musicians. While most kids his age were still learning the rules of life, Keni was already breaking them in rhythm, in tone, in spirit. Their breakout hit came in 1970. The song was called O.H. Child. Its message was simple yet timeless. Things are going to get easier. Those words carried hope through neighborhoods struggling with change, loss, and the uncertainty of a new decade. When the world felt heavy, that song felt like light. It climbed the pop charts to number 8 and sold more than 1 million copies, turning the Five Stairsteps into national stars. For a moment, they stood shoulder to shoulder with the Jackson Five, another family of rising prodigies. But while the Jacksons became household names, the Burkes carried a quieter kind of fame, one built on musicianship rather than media. Behind the curtain, their rehearsals were relentless. Clarence Jr. handled arrangements, their father managed the business, and Keni became the backbone of the sound, the groove that held everything together. Every pluck of his bass line added a new color to the group's harmony. As success grew, so did the pressure. Record labels wanted hits, radio demanded more polished tracks, and the innocent fun of family rehearsals turned into a serious career. Yet Keni stayed grounded. While fame fascinated some, he was drawn more to the craft, to understanding how rhythm could carry emotion. When other teenagers chased applause, Keni chased tone. He listened closely to Curtis Mayfield's subtle chord changes, to Sly Stone's funk experiments, to the smooth phrasing of Motown. Those sounds became his teachers, shaping a young musician who was already thinking like a producer. After O.H. Child, the group released more singles under Buddha Records, including From Us to You and Pasado, songs that reflected their maturity and depth. Each project taught Keni more about the studio, about patience, about how real artistry takes time. But fame, like music, changes its rhythm. By the mid-1970s, some of his siblings had stepped away from the spotlight to start families of their own. The Five Stairsteps began to dissolve, quietly and gracefully. For Keni, it was the end of one chapter but the beginning of something greater. He wasn't content to live off memories of the past. He wanted to find his own sound, something that didn't depend on family or fame, something that would make people feel again. And so, in the middle of that decade, he started walking his own path, not as a son, not as a brother, but as a musician searching for the truth in every note he played. When the Five Stairsteps finally drifted apart, it didn't feel like an ending, at least not to Keni Burke. For him, it felt like silence before the next song. The spotlight had moved on, but his hunger to create never dimmed. By the mid-1970s, he was no longer the teenage bassist behind a family act. He was a young man stepping into his own identity as a songwriter, producer, and composer. And his timing couldn't have been more unpredictable. The world of soul music was shifting, Motown had become a machine, funk was taking over the airwaves, and disco was about to rewrite the rules. Keni found himself somewhere in between. Too soulful to chase trends, too talented to disappear. That's when opportunity came from a most unexpected source across the ocean. Through Billy Preston, Keni was introduced to George Harrison of the Beatles, who had just launched his label Dark Horse Records. Harrison, known for his quiet curiosity about sound and spirituality, saw something familiar in Keni: humility, depth, and an instinct for melody that couldn't be taught. He signed Keni and his siblings, now rebranded as the Stairsteps, to Dark Horse. In 1976, they released Second Resurrection, an album that lived up to its name. It wasn't just another record. It was a rebirth. Keni wrote and produced much of the project, crafting a warm, mature sound that combined the soul of Chicago with the sophistication of Los Angeles studios. Songs like From Us to You carried the optimism of his youth but the precision of a seasoned artist. The record found its audience among musicians and soul purists, those who could hear the craft behind the groove. For Keni, this was the moment everything changed. He realized he no longer needed to stand in anyone's shadow, not his father's, not his brother's, not even the industry's. He had become the architect of his own voice. The album didn't explode on the charts, but it built something far more lasting: respect. Fellow artists began calling him for collaborations. Curtis Mayfield, The Emotions, Billy Preston, Ramsey Lewis all saw in him a rare combination of discipline and soul. By the late 1970s, Keni released his self-produced solo debut, simply titled Keni Burke. It was his statement of independence, the sound of a man who had lived many lives before turning 25. Tracks like Keep On Singing and Get It Up blended rhythm and optimism in a way that only someone who had grown up inside the pulse of soul could create. He wasn't chasing fame, he was building foundation, brick by brick, groove by groove. And slowly, word spread in the music world that Keni Burke was more than a bassist. He was an arranger, a composer, a craftsman whose sound could make any record breathe. In the quiet corners of studios from Chicago to Los Angeles, he was becoming the man other musicians whispered about. the one who didn't need the stage to shine. The turning point wasn't a single hit. It was this realization that true success doesn't always happen under bright lights. Sometimes, it happens in the dim glow of a studio, where one man sits with his instrument and finds truth in every note. By the dawn of 1982, Keni Burke was no longer just a name whispered among musicians. He was a quiet force shaping the rhythm of an entire generation. His years of discipline, patience, and devotion to sound had led to this moment, the release of an album that would define his legacy. It was called Changes, a fitting title for a man who had lived through so many. Every note, every chord, every groove carried the story of his journey from the crowded house in Chicago to the polished studios of Los Angeles. This was not the sound of youth chasing fame. It was the sound of maturity, reflection, and mastery. Then came Risin to the Top. The song opened with a bass line that seemed to breathe steady, confident, and endlessly cool. It didn't demand attention, it earned it. Within weeks, the song found its way onto radios across the country. And in Chicago, it became something more, an anthem, a reminder that no matter how far you fall, the rhythm will always rise again. The record climbed the R&B charts, peaking at number 63, but numbers never told the full story. For those who heard it, Risin to the Top wasn't just music, it was memory. It played in barbershops, in car stereos cruising down summer streets, in small dance clubs where couples swayed to its patient groove. Keni had done something rare. He had created a song that aged with people, one that felt as relevant years later as it did the day it was released. The tone was both triumphant and tender, its lyrics offering quiet resilience in a world obsessed with speed. Behind the scenes, fellow artists took notice. Producers began sampling his bass lines, studying his timing, his restraint. His fingerprints started showing up in other people's songs. Long before the word sampling became a cultural phenomenon, Keni's sound had already begun echoing through new generations of music. The song became a blueprint for hip-hop and modern R&B, inspiring artists from Doug E. Fresh to Mary J. Blige. It bridged the gap between eras, the warmth of the old soul and the confidence of the new groove. And yet, even as the record spread across cities and continents, Keni remained grounded. He wasn't chasing spotlights or headlines. He spent his days in studios, headphones on, quietly perfecting his craft. Fame never changed him, music did. When people asked how it felt to have his songs sampled by younger artists, he smiled and said it felt like watching your children grow. The world had finally caught up to a sound he'd been making all along. At that moment, in the still glow of 1982, Keni Burke stood at the top, not of the charts, but of his art. His music carried grace, groove, and the unmistakable heartbeat of Chicago soul. Every artist has that moment, the quiet after applause, the silence that feels heavier than sound. For Keni Burke, that moment came slowly, almost invisibly, after the release of Changes. On the surface, life seemed steady. His song, Risin to the Top, had found immortality, becoming a hidden heartbeat of black radio and underground DJs. But in the larger world of music, trends were shifting. The 1980 landscape was changing fast. New technology, new genres, new faces. The industry wanted something flashier, younger, louder. Keni's music, built on patience and groove, didn't fit that equation anymore. He wasn't bitter, just quietly aware. The same record executives who once admired his precision now called it too mellow. Radio stations moved toward electronic beats, and disco's collapse left soul artists stranded in between eras. The artistry that made Keni timeless was now considered old school. Still, he refused to compromise. In interviews, when asked why he didn't chase pop trends, he answered simply, "Because that's not who I am." He chose dignity over demand, a decision that cost him visibility but kept him real. He continued recording, producing, and collaborating behind the scenes. His bass lines could be heard on records by The Whispers, George Howard, and Keith Sweat, though few outside the studio knew it was him. He was becoming what many legends become before history remembers them, invisible in plain sight. The world was dancing to his rhythm without realizing whose hands created it. By the late 1980s, hip-hop producers began to rediscover his work. They sampled Risin to the Top, and wove it into a new language, one built on beats, street poetry, and survival. Keni watched with quiet pride as his melody found a second life through Doug E. Fresh's Keep Risin to the Top, and later in Mary J. Blige's Love No Limit. His music had crossed generations, yet his name remained missing from the headlines. That paradox to be heard everywhere but known nowhere became the burden of his brilliance. He had given the world rhythm, and in return, the world forgot to give him recognition. Friends said Keni never complained. He would smile, shrug, and keep playing. Music was still his sanctuary, but those close to him noticed the change, the long nights alone in the studio, the way he sometimes stared at old photographs of the Five Stairsteps, the family that started it all. There's a kind of loneliness that comes not from failure, but from being misunderstood. Keni had achieved something few musicians ever do. He had made a timeless record, yet the industry that once celebrated him no longer called, and the spotlight that once warmed him now cast its glow elsewhere. He released more albums, You're the Best, under RCA, Nothing But Love in 1998, through a UK label, each project filled with craftsmanship and honesty. Critics admired them, audiences overseas cherished them, but in his own country, they passed almost unnoticed. Maybe that was the hardest part to watch. The sound he created flourish in other hands while his own went unseen. And yet, in every interview, every small performance, Keni remained grateful. "I'm still here," he once said softly. "That's all I ever wanted, to still be here." The seeds of tragedy in his story weren't drugs, scandal, or downfall. They were silence, and time, the slow erosion of attention that fame brings to even the most deserving souls. While others chased the charts, Keni kept chasing truth, and in that quiet pursuit, he became what few artists ever do, not a star that burned out, but a steady light that the world simply stopped looking at. By the mid-1980s, Keni Burke had already given the world his masterpiece. But like many artists whose light burns too pure, his greatest work became both his gift and his shadow. The industry had changed. So had the audience. The warmth of live soul was being replaced by machines, and producers wanted something faster, simpler, cheaper. Keni wasn't built for shortcuts. He believed in melody, in grooves that told stories, and in a world chasing instant hits, that kind of patience became a burden. His phone stopped ringing as often. The sessions grew fewer, the paychecks smaller. What once felt like a community now felt like a closed circle that had moved on without him. He continued to write and produce, often for other artists, quietly leaving his touch on records that never carried his name. He worked with George Howard, Peabo Bryson, the Jones Girls, and others who still believed in musicianship. But even then, recognition stayed out of reach. His sound was everywhere, his name nowhere. There's a different kind of pain in that, not the sting of failure, but the ache of invisibility. To walk into a record store and hear your music playing through someone else's success. To see others profit from the rhythm you created. Keni never showed resentment, but those who knew him could see it in his eyes, that distant look of someone carrying a truth no one wanted to hear. He spent more time alone in his home studio. The bass guitar, once a tool of joy, became his confidant. He would play for hours, sometimes through the night, chasing tones no one else might ever hear. To him, that was enough because music had always been his refuge. But beneath the calm, there was exhaustion. The phone calls from record labels eventually stopped. The tours faded. Younger musicians asked him for advice, for riffs, for wisdom, but rarely for credit. And though he smiled and helped them anyway, he felt something slipping away, not talent, but time. By the 1990s, nostalgia began reviving the sound he had pioneered. Ironically, his fingerprints could be found all over the new wave of retro soul. Yet few realized they were borrowing from the man himself. He watched quietly, proud, but tired. The world loved his sound, it just forgot his name. There were no tabloid stories, no headlines, just a man, a legend in silence, still playing because it was all he'd ever known. For him, music wasn't a career, it was a way of breathing. And as long as he could hold his bass, he would never stop. Still, even the most faithful heart can feel the weight of being unseen. Sometimes, late at night, he would listen to Risin to the Top and smile, not out of pride, but peace. Because no matter how far the world drifted, that song still carried him. It was his reminder that once, Even if only for a moment, he reached the top and did it with soul, truth, and grace. The hardest part of fading from the spotlight isn't being forgotten by the public, it's being forgotten by the world you helped create. For Keni Burke, the silence that followed his peak years was not dramatic or sudden. It came quietly, like dusk settling over a once busy street. One by one, the familiar voices stopped calling. The stages where he once stood grew smaller, and yet his sound, that warm, patient groove, refused to die. Across America, the seeds he planted years earlier began to bloom in unexpected places. Hip-hop DJs sampled his records without even realizing who he was. A few recognized his genius producers like Doug E. Fresh, who built Keep Risin to the top on Keni's timeless groove. Later, artists such as Mary J. Blige and LL Cool J would turn his melody into new anthems for a new generation. His rhythm lived on, even when his name disappeared. That irony carried both pride and sorrow. He had become a ghost in his own legacy everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Friends recall visiting him in those years, finding him surrounded by instruments, notebooks, and quiet. He would smile when his old songs came on the radio, nodding gently, never bitter. "They found something in it," he once said softly. "That means it was worth making." But deep down, there was loneliness, the kind that doesn't make noise, the kind that grows from watching the world dance to your rhythm and not even know it came from you. Keni had given the music world so much, and in return, the industry gave him absence. No headlines, no retrospectives, no Hollywood call to honor the man behind the melody. He released more work in the years that followed. You're the Best, Nothing But Love, albums rich in craft and spirit. Overseas, in places like London and Tokyo, small audiences still cherished his sound. They called him a pioneer, a master of groove. But in America, where his story began, the silence lingered. Every once in a while, an old fan would recognize him at a show or reach out online to say how Risin to the Top changed their life. He would write back, always gracious. Those small gestures mattered. They reminded him that music never truly vanishes, it just waits to be heard again. Through all of it, Keni never turned bitter. He never blamed anyone. He simply kept creating. His songs became softer, more reflective, less about rhythm and more about memory. The music was no longer about success. It was about survival. He had learned something the charts could never teach, that greatness isn't about being remembered by millions. It's about leaving behind something honest, even if only a few people still listen. And so, even as time kept moving forward, Keni Burke kept playing. Somewhere in the background of every sampled beat, every soulful record, his sound still lingers quiet, uncredited, eternal. Legacy is a strange thing. It doesn't always arrive with awards or applause sometimes. It comes quietly, long after the lights have faded. For Keni Burke, that legacy began to reveal itself not through fame, but through sound. Even decades after Risin to the Top first played on radio airwaves, its heartbeat never stopped. The song became more than a track, it became a thread running through generations of American music. Its bass line slipped into hip-hop, its melody found new life in R&B, and its spirit lived inside every artist who understood that groove was more than rhythm, it was truth. In New York, DJs in the Bronx spun his record during early block parties, using its groove to bridge the gap between soul and rap. In Los Angeles, producers studied his tone, trying to capture the same warmth without losing its humanity. In Chicago, his hometown, Risin to the Top became a kind of anthem, the soundtrack for resilience. People who knew struggle, who'd fought to stay standing, found something sacred in that song. It was survival set to music. Across the ocean, Keni's name carried a different kind of weight. In the UK, where rare groove culture celebrated musicians overlooked by the mainstream, Risin to the Top became a classic. Collectors searched for original vinyl copies, and DJs spun it like a secret they wanted to share. To them, Keni wasn't forgotten, he was revered. His records traveled farther than he ever imagined, from small London clubs to Tokyo bars, where soul enthusiasts still played his music on worn turntables. What made his influence unique was its honesty. Keni Burke didn't just make songs, he built templates. Musicians who came after him studied the architecture of his sound, the clean bass, the understated melody, the way his records felt alive even in their quiet moments. That kind of artistry can't be taught. It can only be lived. Over time, his name began appearing in unexpected places on credits, in samples, in whispers between generations of musicians. Mary J. Blige, LL Cool J, and Doug E. Fresh all carried fragments of his sound into new eras. But beyond the samples, there was something more enduring: the respect of those who understood. In the American soul community, Keni became a quiet symbol of integrity. He was proof that you could stay true to your sound, even when the world stopped listening. That being forgotten by the charts didn't mean being erased from history. His work reminded musicians that legacy isn't measured by fame, it's measured by the lives your music continues to touch. And while Hollywood and the major labels rarely spoke his name, the people who mattered most, the listeners, the musicians, the dreamers, never stopped hearing him. His songs still play at weddings, reunions, family cookouts, and late-night gatherings, moments where nostalgia meets gratitude. Because for many, Risin to the Top isn't just a song, it's a feeling. A reminder that no matter how far you fall, you can always rise again. Time has a way of revealing what truly matters. And in the years that followed, Keni Burke's story became less about what he lost and more about what he left behind. In 2022, he stood once again under the lights, not the blinding glare of youth, but the softer glow of remembrance. The National Rhythm and Blues Music Society honored him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. For many in the audience, it was more than a ceremony. It was a long overdue acknowledgement. They weren't just celebrating a man, they were recognizing a foundation. As the applause filled the room, Keni smiled the way only an artist who has known both silence and sound can. He wasn't a man chasing the past anymore. He was standing inside it, surrounded by those who had carried his rhythm forward without even realizing it. That night, something shifted. For once, his name wasn't behind the curtain or in the liner notes. It was on the stage, spoken with respect. To the new generation, he wasn't a mystery anymore, he was a master. In interviews that followed, he spoke with calm gratitude. "Music has been my whole life," he said. "It gave me everything, even the quiet years." That sentence alone explained why his story still matters. It wasn't about bitterness or blame. It was about devotion, about a man who gave his life to his craft without ever expecting the world to notice. Looking back, his journey feels like a mirror of the American soul, filled with rhythm, struggle, faith, and endurance. He came from a time when families sang together, when songs carried hope instead of headlines. And through it all, he never stopped believing that music could heal. His influence didn't fade, it evolved. Every time a young artist layers a groove beneath a melody, every time a hip-hop producer flips an old soul record into something new, a piece of Keni Burke lives in that moment. He became what every true artist hopes to be: timeless without trying. Abroad, his music continues to play in quiet corners, in cafes, in Paris, in Tokyo record shops, in London soul nights where DJs still drop Risin to the Top as a closing track. They say no song ends a night more perfectly because it doesn't shout goodbye. It whispers, "Until next time." That's what his music always did. It never demanded attention. It earned it. And in that lies the reflection of his life. An artist who didn't need the world to validate him. The respect came late, but it came honestly not through numbers, but through hearts. Keni Burke never wanted to be a superstar. He wanted to be understood. And today, through every groove that carries his fingerprint, he finally is. He may never have had his Hollywood star, but his name lives where it truly counts, in the songs people still hum, in the bass lines that still move their feet, and in the quiet truth that greatness doesn't need to be loud to last forever. The bass line hums again, soft, familiar, eternal. It's the same rhythm that began in a small house on the south side of Chicago, where a young boy once dreamed of music big enough to reach the world. Decades later, that boy, now a man, a father, a legend, stands as proof that greatness doesn't always live in the spotlight. Keni Burke's story is one of devotion, of quiet excellence, and of faith in the craft when no one else is watching. He didn't chase fame, he chased truth. And that truth still echoes through every note he left behind. When you listen to Risin to the Top, you can almost hear time itself, the laughter of his family rehearsing in their living room, the hum of the bass that carried him through every high and low, the heartbeat of a city that raised him. His music was never just about sound. It was about survival, love, and dignity. Hollywood may have forgotten to give him a star, but the world gave him something greater: endurance. His groove lives in every sample, every remix, every moment when someone closes their eyes and nods to that rhythm without even knowing who wrote it. That's what true legacy sounds like. Some stories don't need sequels or comebacks. They just need to be remembered. Keni's journey reminds us that artistry isn't measured by fame or fortune, it's measured by how deeply your work connects to the soul. And in that measure, he stands among giants. If you ever find yourself listening to that familiar groove, remember the man behind it, the one who turned rhythm into reflection, the one who kept playing long after the applause had faded. Do you think Hollywood ever gave Keni Burke the respect he truly deserved? If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and help us keep their light alive. Leave a comment below, tell us what Keni's music means to you, or simply say his name, because remembering is how legends live forever. And as the final notes of Risin to the Top fade into silence, one truth remains. Some stars never fade, they just shine where fewer eyes can see.